Welcome to the Bros of Gardening. I'm Mike Westphal, and I'm joined by my co-host Daniel Van Dyke. And today we are talking about spring prep for the garden or the landscape. So how you doing, Daniel?
Good. How you doing, buddy?
Good. So we've also got, of course, Alex behind the scenes. You won't see him, but you'll hear him throughout the podcast asking questions and kind of helping us if we have any questions to ask him to look up for us. So Alex, how would you like us to get started on spring prep?
Well, let's see here. When preparing for the spring, what steps should you take to maximize your time in the garden without having to backtrack on decisions you no longer wish to implement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's planning. I mean, they talk about it in business. That's what I went to school for, is business. Location. I think for gardening, it's planning.
Absolutely.
A little bit of planning goes a long way. I mean, thinking about what you want to do. I mean, we talked about it a little bit when we talked about like winter, like what you can do in the winter. But now that spring is quickly approaching, what are you going to do? And you got to start making some decisions, and planning, I think, goes a long way. Is it, do you want to create a butterfly garden? Do you want to start composting this year? What are you going to do? And what's your top priority? I think listing it out. I always have a little bit of a garden list, maybe some drawings, just kind of stuff that'll help me kind of guide me through the year.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, planning, this is the perfect time to do it. Obviously, we're starting to warm up a little bit, hopefully here, coming months. And so as we start to work into that, you're really, like we talked about a few weeks ago, we're starting to hit kind of that threshold of this is when you really want to take advantage of cooler temperatures, but hopefully we're warming up now enough to where it's not miserable to be outside, but then also start to stimulate some root growth and some stuff like that. And so, but again, like you said, if you don't want to have to backtrack, I think the key is planning. And I think prioritizing a list is a perfect, is example of doing that. Because as much as I'd love to do everything that we can in the garden and tackle every single, need and want that I have, that can be a bit overwhelming from a resource standpoint, from a time and effort standpoint. And so planning out that is a good way to kind of focus in on what do you want to prioritize and what is going to be the main thing that you try to tackle. And so, and also in that planning time period, different things plant at different times. And so this is why planning can be important because, one of the first things that's going to start popping up, if not already, is those daffodil bulbs. You might have seen them, stuff like that. But those actually plant in the fall. So that's where it's like if you plan out this list of kind of what you want to accomplish, then you kind of have a guideline throughout the entire year. And then this is kind of when you'll hit the point where you want to start focusing on what you can plant and different things like that.
For sure. And I think, very important to know your frost date when you're planning, because you'll start seeing things in the garden center that it's like, I should get started on this. You might see some vegetable plants popping up and, basil and different things that aren't quite frost tolerant.
Sure.
So knowing your frost dates here in southeastern Virginia, we're right around tax day. It's an easy day to remember. April 15th, April 10th, somewhere in that range. So know your tax day. Everybody knows the tax day, but tax day is not
still important.
That is not always going to be your frost date. So know your frost date where you live. If you don't know, ask your local garden center. They will definitely know. Trust me, we're protecting and trying to protect hundreds and thousands of plants. So we know our frost date. We're watching the weather. I think it's important to know what causes a frost too.
Sure.
So, you need clear skies, below 40 degrees, and no wind. That creates a frost.
Yeah.
So if it's below 40 and there's not a lick of wind out there and there's clear skies, no clouds in the sky, then you're going to get a frost the next day. So it's important to know that. So, you have to have all three of those elements line up in order to get a frost. And of course, it gets harder. The frost gets harder. You might hear a hard frost as it gets colder. So, you got different types of frost and then, of course, a freeze. So, freeze would be the worst. So knowing your frost dates, knowing what causes a frost, I think is quintessential and essential in planning and getting ready for spring.
Right. Well, and another part of planning that I always like to tell people too is kind of the reflection of how the garden performed last year. And that will also kind of lend itself to creating your priority list. But I've always said one of my favorite things about if you have annual pockets or containers, we've talked about a lot of these different aspects that we've said you can be more experimental in.
Yep.
Well, it might be out of sight, out of mind at this point. So like thinking back through it, if you have photos of the landscape or containers, to see what you liked and what worked, maybe what was more effort than you wanted it to be. And so this is when you make those decisions on what you want to change out and what you want to go with moving forward. So you don't have to go back and recreate the wheel every single time. And so that's kind of the other side of the experimental part of containers and annuals and things of that nature is you need to think back and say, okay, what did I like? What do I want to repeat? repeat, or, do I want to change it up, go with something completely different? Or again, if you just like to have fun with it, maybe you want to change it up just for the sake of changing it. But I think like thinking back on what your landscape did, it's hard to think back of what things looked like in the summer. It's hard to think back of what they looked like even in the fall. But being able to do that is going to help dictate what you want to do moving forward. And I think that's an important step in the process as well.
Yeah. And I think, you hit the nail on the head there with notes and trying to remember what you did last year. Taking notes. I mean, I think about vegetable gardening. Whenever I teach a class on vegetable gardening, I always tell people, take notes of what did well for you, what performed well, but also where you planted it. You don't have to be a landscape designer like you, but you can just draw an aerial, hey, this is where I planted my peppers and my tomatoes last year. And, keep that drawing and those notes of what you liked and what you didn't like, so that when you go back to those the next year, you have them to resort to. Plus, crop rotation is important.
Yep.
So you're going to be looking at, trying to get, your tomatoes not planted in the exact same spot. And maybe this year you're going to do cucumbers or squash or zucchini. So, knowing those types of things really help a lot. I love the picture. I mean, I didn't even think about that. I never even talk about that. I always talk about a drawing, but taking some photos is a great option to be able to kind of go back and look at those.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we do that a lot because if we have customers and things like that reach out, we're always asking for photos, like so that we have an understanding if they're having an issue, or even if it's just a good thing, like, hey, look how amazing, we appreciate any positive photos as well. But so we get in the habit of asking them to take pictures, and that kind of creates this storybook throughout the year of kind of how things look. And so even just thinking now moving forward, if we're listening to this, as your seasons progress, taking photos of it, even if it's not necessarily something you want to post on social media because of how beautiful it is, but that'll be a reminder to you in these planning phases of what you can really do. And when you want to do it, because I always say, as we're still cool now, I'd rather get outside right now than I would, at the end of May, beginning of June. So if you some of the grunt work, even if we're not quite ready for planting, whether it's the frost date or availability, you can do removals, you can do some of the prep work, you can start doing those types of things to really get ready to hit the ground running, so that you're not trying to do everything at once. You can space out some of this stuff, so that way you can tackle different phases of it throughout so it doesn't seem as overwhelming, or it's not as time consuming when the time does come to actually do your planting.
Yeah, if you didn't get your pruning done in the winter, or late winter, early spring is still a good time to do it. So you still got time to do your pruning. You want to divide some perennials.
Absolutely.
It's a great time to divide perennials, transplant shrubs and trees and things like that. It's a great time to kind of take all of those into account, and timing is really, really important. And I think everybody's so itchy to get out of the cold and out of their house and into the yard that sometimes people push the envelope too much.
For sure.
And so, that's where it goes back to the planning part, but also understanding that there's seasons throughout the season.
Absolutely.
There's a early spring, there's a mid spring, and a late spring. And so it's kind of knowing that, and when you're planning out things, if you're a weekend warrior, we can help you out. I mean, you guys are weekend warriors and daily warriors. When you go out and do a landscape, you're ripping it out and reinstalling in one day. But for a homeowner that might want to do that, know that, hey, you might not be able to get it all at that same exact time. So if you're looking to do like a butterfly garden, let's say, then you start early, plan a little bit, but know that you might not get, the butterfly weed or the milkweed, or some of those really, really great pollinator plants, or those attractors, those host plant nectar plants that you can incorporate into that design. You might not be able to get them in the garden center until mid or late spring, because in the retail side of things, usually we're not going to put them on the sales floor. We're not going to buy them in and have them ready for our customers until they're doing what they do, until they're blooming. So, you're not going to find a dormant lantana in our garden center. You're going to have to wait until it's blooming and growing, and that's when we're going to carry it.
Yeah, well, and along those same lines, we do the same thing. I mean, this is a perfect time to plant for us right now, heading into spring, taking advantage of the cooler weather. But we always do have to warn customers, availability is a thing. And so, even if we can't put everything in, we'd rather come in, do the removals, do the prep work, like you said. We'll plant the evergreen shrubs, we'll plant some stuff, but you do have to take into account availability in this time of year where we're starting to get some of the stuff in. Like we see the hints of spring kind of rolling in, but at the same time, we do need to be patient. And a lot of times that's because, the growers, and like you said, what we want, what is going to look good. And so, we'll say, hey, we can create a ticket to come back and install some of those key items, especially you mentioned like butterfly gardens and stuff.
Yep.
So even on the landscape side where we can order in things that have gone dormant, just availability in general, sometimes you just got to be a little patient with it.
Yeah, and I think looking at how are you going to plant? Let's take like annuals for example. Are you going to start them from seeds? Are you gonna, buy them in packs and starter plants basically, or are you gonna wait for the 4-inch and the 6-inch season? Which 4-inch and 6-inch probably is a little bit of a term that not a lot of beginning gardeners or customers might not know about. But those are more established plants, and so you're getting a little bit more instant gratification, especially when we're talking about annuals. So seed starting definitely takes some planning. You want to know your frost dates there. You got to pick out your varieties. You can get those now. I mean, that's early spring. Late winter is a great time to start thinking about what kind of seeds you're going to grow, whether it's vegetables, herbs, or flowers, or whatever it might be that you decide to. But then you need to know how long it's going to take to germinate.
Right.
All of that information. That's a whole nother topic that can go on for hours. I teach classes on seed starting, and it takes an hour and a half to kind of get all the information out. And that's just seed starting. But you need to plan for it. You need to think about it. And then I kind of have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with packs. I don't know what your experience is, but I'm sure landscape doesn't use a lot of them.
No, we don't. And I mean, just because, again, a lot of times our customers are looking for things that are a little bit more established, have a little bit more size to them. Again, if you're early in the season and you're really anxious to get started, there's a reason they're available sooner than the 6-inch and some of the larger annuals and stuff.
For sure.
But yeah, I mean, we don't do much with packs just because they are so small. But again, if you're trying to, if you like to mix a lot of different things together, sometimes for spatial reasons, packs still obviously serve a great purpose. It's just a lot of times in bedding plants and stuff like that, we'll wait to have a little bit bigger one. And a lot of times that does coincide, getting through that frost date and really getting through it so that we're ready to plant those without having to worry anything about it.
The value is certainly there when it comes to packs. I mean, you're not going to get a better deal than that.
No.
I mean, you don't have to go through the whole seed starting process and the germination and buying all the, little greenhouses and jiffy pots and seed starter soil and all the different things you got to do there. You get them basically as little starter plants. And so you can mix them and they're a lot of fun. I love using them in containers. I've definitely done landscape with them before and big pockets of color. It takes a little bit. It's a little bit more tedious because you got to plug all these little plugs in. But it's a great value. And you mentioned bulbs earlier too. I think bulbs is a huge value. You never think, how many customers come in and say, I want daffodil bulbs when they're blooming.
Exactly. And that's
the planning part of it. But there are a lot of bulbs that you can plant in the spring that'll bloom in the summertime frame. So, if you're thinking, man, I missed out on the daffodil season, you didn't miss out on the whole bulb season. So there's lots of different things that you can do there, like crocus and elephant ears and, peonies and lots of different types of things. So you got lots of options there. And then of course, as the season progresses, you get into bigger plant material, and that's typically where I love to live. And so sometimes I try and get some of the other stuff out of the way, like you said, the hard work. Yeah. And then do more of the fun stuff as the bigger plant material comes in. That's what I love.
That's definitely how I approach it. I try to get all of my maintenance, my pruning, kind of the labor of love, get the pruning done and try to get the removals ready to go. And then that's when it's like, okay, now that all this beautiful color is rolling in and everything's getting ready, now once we get through that frost date, I can get my tropicals and my 6-inch annuals and all those types of things. And we're ready to go. So I do. And plus, like I said, I'd rather work in the cold than the heat. So I'm going to take advantage of the cool days while we still have some, but maybe not as bitterly cold as we've been the past couple months. So try to take advantage of that. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. You try to get all that stuff done. So then when the fun stuff comes, the planting, the different annuals and stuff like that, you're ready to go. Yeah. And again, I think it's just, when you take it piece by piece, it's just a lot easier to kind of focus in, and it doesn't feel as overwhelming. Which is
prioritizing.
We say dive in the deep end when it comes to gardening in general, but that's, I think, pacing yourself at the same time, like so that you don't get overwhelmed and discouraged. Because once you start these projects, you can look back and be like, okay, this is a little bit more than I had intended. So taking it piece by piece certainly has its advantages.
I think great tip. And I mean, that pruning and transplanting and dividing and doing all of that stuff, as you might be waiting for frost dates and more plant material to show up in your local garden centers is, one great tip that I always give people. And it's always usually too late, unfortunately, but it's clean out all that leaf litter too.
Yes.
I mean, hydrangeas, Everybody that has a hydrangea has probably had leaf spot at some point in time. And it's a fungus that gets on the leaves and it lives in the leaf litter underneath the shrub, when it drops its leaves in the winter. And so if you get in there in the, early springtime, get all that leaf litter out, it'll really benefit from it. And you might not even have to deal with that. So clean up those leaves, get all the leaves out of the way, prune and all that stuff.
We're almost to the fun part. You just got to keep getting some of this stuff knocked out and you'll be ready to roll.
Do a little bit of planning, think about what kind of color you want. What you got, Alex? You got another question?
I do, yes. So if you can only do one thing, let's say this season, what would you do exactly? And you can go into your own specific beds.
All right, so you said only do one thing, so naturally I'll probably give you at least two. But so one thing we've already touched on a little bit, definitely pruning. I'm a big advocate of pruning this time of year, but something else that I think people don't think about because it's out of sight, out of mind. So for me, pre-emerging. Yeah. So pre-emerging your landscape beds, I think is such an important thing right now. Weeds usually aren't as prevalent when it's cold out. I mean, there are some cold winter weeds, but your beds are probably fairly clean right now from weeds and stuff. But if you can get, the way pre-emergent works is obviously it stops the seeds from germinating. And so if you can get the pre-emergent down, once you see the weeds, the pre-emergent's not going to help. Yep. You've got to then spray or pull them, whatever your, method is there. But so if you can pre-emerge now before you start to see the warmer weather and these warm weather weeds popping up, it's going to make your life so much easier moving forward. So I would say, outside of pruning, which is a big one, I would say pre-emerging is going to save you a lot of time and energy in the months to come if you can get that knocked out right now before you really start to notice the weeds. Because by the time you see the weeds germinating, you're a little too late.
Exactly. So. Yeah, pre-emergent is a huge one, especially for the lawn too. But you can use it in your landscape beds and your flower beds. Know where you're going to use it. Are you going to be seeding vegetables in there? In midsummer, are you planning on growing a lawn or starting a new lawn from seed that you don't want to use it? Depends on which type you use. Some of them can last 4 weeks, some of them can last 6 to 8 weeks, so some can last longer. That goes back to that planning part, but pre-emergent's huge. And then what you can do is you can pre-emerge and then mulch. Mulch would be mine. I love what mulch does for plants and for the landscape. I think, it finishes it off. It makes it look so complete. It's an easy thing to do. And you can even do it before you kind of really get planting. I always like to do it after I'm done planting everything as much as possible. And it depends too. I've got huge oak trees.
I would say, how dense are you planting? Yeah, there's a lot of them.
I've got these huge oak trees and they drop all that, pollen and stuff. And so it eventually goes away. So do you mulch before that or after that? It depends on if you've got messy shade trees nearby. That's where your planning and your notes from the past kind of help guide you into when you want to do that. But mulching is a great one. I'll throw out one more, which is in that same vein of the pre-emergent, which is doing a preventative spray for insect and disease. Yeah. I mean, it is amazing. I mean, Triple Action is a product that we recommend a lot. It's made by Fertilume. It's completely organic. It's OMRI listed. It's a great one to kind of spray across the landscape because it's a fungicide, insecticide, and miticide. So it's not a herbicide. It's not going to kill any weeds. Not going to do anything for you there. Use the pre-emergent. Yep. But the Triple Action is a great one. It's light. It does a little bit of work for you. And typically what people say is after I do kind of a broadcast spray across my shrubs and my ornamentals and different things like that, it looks like I fed them because they just come out of that, winter, dormant period and into the spring season and they're just ready to roll and they don't have to deal with maybe some of that lingering effects from the last season. So I always say be preventative, not curative.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a great option there.
And I think something, just to piggyback off what you said was, mulching. And so one thing that I have noticed a lot is when you are applying pre-emergent to the beds, just to give a little tip of the trade, I suppose. But what we like to do is if you have enough pre-emergent, depending on the size of your beds, we put down pre-emergent underneath and on top of the mulch. Oh, yeah. But I do recommend if you're only going to do it to one or the other, I would go on top of the mulch just because the mulch can, it's a nice bedding area for
It can
weed
grow
seed and stuff like that
Exactly.
too. So if you put that pre-emergent underneath the mulch and then put this beautiful layer of mulch, well, if the weeds are growing in the mulch, then that pre-emergent isn't going to help. So I always, as you can probably tell, I'm not a big fan of weeds. So
Right.
I'm very adamant about pre-emerging. So
Nobody
we'll
is.
actually
You're not
go,
alone.
we'll go underneath and on top of the mulch. But if you're only going to do one or the other, I would recommend going on top of the mulch. We've actually done some of our own testing here with pre-emergent to see what does the best, because that's, when we go out and do a landscape, the last thing we want is, I always tell people we till up the soil, we add all these great nutrients, all these different things that make the plants thrive. But unfortunately, those nutrients aren't, selective about what they help. So it's a beautiful breeding ground for weeds as well.
Exactly.
So we try to do everything we can to prevent those weeds. And so we've done a lot of different research and kind of, tried to study that as much as possible. And that's, having obviously attacking it from both angles, on top and underneath the mulch. But if you're only going to do one or the other, I would go on top of the mulch. That's what we've had the most success with.
And education is a great option too.
Sure.
I mean, we are here at McDonald Garden Center doing lots of educational classes and seminars, and we do that a lot in early spring.
Sure.
Once it gets into mid-spring, we're busy.
Yeah,
we got a lot of
absolutely.
plants and a lot of product to water and a lot of customers to help. So it's a great time to get educated, whether you're doing it online, visiting your local garden centers. Kind of like that goes back to that planning process is, get a little bit smarter on what you want to do. And hopefully that's what we're doing for our customers and for our listeners is educating them a little bit on what they might do as far as spring prep goes. So, Alex, you got anything else for us?
Okay, so if you're not quite ready yet for plant material, are there any other aspects of the landscape that you can be focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, even if you're not ready for planting, or even if maybe you're not focusing on the garden beds this spring, there's a lot of other aspects of the landscape and the yard that you can focus on. Similarly to like we talked about with like the daffodils and stuff.
Exactly.
Once you see them, you're probably a little too late for this year. Same concept applies when it's when the nights and when the days get a little bit cooler and you have these beautiful, nice spring nights where you want to be outside enjoying the outdoors. If that's when you make the decision to install your patio or get your sitting area or entertaining area ready, you're probably a little too late. So I always tell people, if your goal is, hey, you want to entertain outdoors this spring, you want to capture and take advantage of that beautiful weather, you should really be doing that now so that you're ready to do that. Because I know at least how we operate, we get pretty busy in the spring and our backlog will fill up, and it may take a couple weeks, even a month or two, in order to get a project going, and so if it's April 15th, we've referenced that day now before. If it's we have this beautiful weather, we've avoided the frost, we're ready to entertain outdoors. Well, if that's when you make your first call to try to get something installed or put in, chances are you're probably going to be waiting till fall, or by the time it installs, it's going to be the dead of summer, and then you're not going to want to be outdoors anymore necessarily. So I would say try to focus on if it is not quite time to plant, whether that's a water feature, whatever the case may be, you can pretty much explore different opportunities to do that this time of year that aren't plant centric if you're not quite ready for that. So, it's a great question, but I would certainly focus on, your hardscapes and things like that aren't weather contingent. If you wanted to do a rock garden, you wanted to, switch out mulch for rock mulch, whatever, or
Stepping
rock covering.
stones,
Yeah, stepping
all of
stones,
that
whatever
stuff.
the case may be. All of that stuff that's not weather contingent at all, you're good to go. And and again, it's a cool enough time to where you're not going to be sweating to death when you're out there working. And so I always say embrace the cooler weather, because once you get going on some of those hardscape elements, you're going to appreciate the cooler weather for sure.
Yeah, and certainly you'll find it's a little bit easier to book a landscaper.
Absolutely.
A little bit earlier in the season. So spring is coming. You cannot stop it. Love the comment about the water feature. Statuary works right into that. If you're like itching to get in the garden center, come on into the garden center. We got lots of options for you. You can pick out all your patio pots. Maybe you want to switch out the color of your ceramic containers. Maybe you've been doing blue and you want to switch to red or green or black or whatever it might be. You can come and pick out new containers. You don't have to plant them right away, but that way the next time you come and you pick up your plants in your soil, you're ready to plant them. So there's so many different things you can do: patio furniture, umbrellas, all of that what we call hardscapes or decoratives.
And I'm sure we're getting in a ton of new product. See all the stuff for this
Get
spring.
to see the new stuff. Get your new pair of gloves. Whatever you need, some new tools, that kind of stuff, so you can do the pruning and all that good stuff. But also think about houseplants. I mean, it's a great time to think
sure.
about houseplants. I mean, we definitely talk about it a lot in the late winter season, early spring season, because it is some plant material that you can, get your hands on and start to work on. So if you're looking to add to a collection, it's also, if you're thinking about moving your houseplants out, a lot of people take their houseplants outside for a summer vacation, is what I like to call it. And so you might want to do some prep for that. So if you're thinking about moving your houseplants outside to the front porch or patio, then, it's a good time to replant them. That you might need to upgrade the size of your pot. Biggest tip there is don't go too big. I always tell people, if you've got, a 5 to 6 inch plant in a pot and you want to make it big, put it in a big pot isn't going to get you there. It'll do fine through the summer months because outside you have evaporation, you've got wind, you've got all of those elements that'll help dry out the excess soil. But when you bring it back in and you've got a lot of excessive soil wrapped around that root ball, then it's not going to dry out. So grade up small. So go from, 2 inches. So if you got a 6-inch plant, go up to an 8-inch pot. So you're not putting a ton of potting soil around it. So that's a great time to do that. Inspect your houseplants. Look for any disease, insect issues that you might have. Now's the time to treat before you move them outside because you've got them in a bit of a quarantine type of situation. Sure. So it's a great time to kind of do all those things, but also add to your collection. You're going to find a huge selection of houseplants typically in garden centers, especially in that January, February, March time frame.
Absolutely.
So before spring hits, look at your houseplants. It's a great opportunity. If you're not doing them, you should. They're so much fun.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of opportunities there. So, all right, I think that wraps it up for us, right, Alex?
Sure does.
So join us next week where we'll be talking to Heather Wheatley again, our first guest, and now she'll be our second guest as well, where we'll be reviewing some of our favorite proven winner plants, hear a little bit more about proven winners and how they test all of their plants. And so it should be a really exciting episode of The Bros of Gardening. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.